Hey guys, this is Andrew with High Level Reviews, and today I'd like to talk about Wild Arms. It was developed by a relatively unknown company called MediaVision and published by Sony. It was released in North America in April of 1997 on the PS1 and was eventually remade for the PS2 as Wild Arms Alter Code F. I'll be sticking to the original for this review for reasons that I'll discuss at the end. Wild Arms, which incorporated Western themes and motifs with science fiction and fantasy and was modeled after the American Old West and medieval Europe, was unfortunately overshadowed by Final Fantasy VII's release later that year and almost instantaneously relegated to the realm of play this until Final Fantasy VII is released. However, Wild Arms flawlessly executes a lot of JRPG genre staples while still managing to add its own flavor and touches to that typical experience. There are engaging, fun, and thought-provoking puzzles, though with some occasionally shading more towards trial and error than actually promoting pattern recognition or mind-bending conundrums. Not that I was necessarily bothered by that, but some contemporary reviewers certainly were. The combat is in many ways standard turn-based, but has, again, several wrinkles that keep it from slipping into monotony. In fact, the combat and puzzle portions of the game often saved it from the long stretches of little to no story-related events or exposition. Make no mistake, the story itself is undervalued in the JRPG catalog. Its late-game turns and revelations are excellent, but some of the mid-game lulls were near torturous and flirted too often with player disconnection. Still, Wild Arms does most things well, despite not necessarily being a huge standout in any single category, while not relying on cheap cardboard genre cutouts to fill out the title. The creators didn't subordinate any aspect of the game, each was developed and polished and felt unique because of it. The game starts by allowing the player to elect one of the three main characters, Rudy Roughnight, Jack Van Buren, and Cecilia Lynn Adelheid. Each character has a unique beginning that details how he or she meets up with the rest of the team. Rudy is a 15-year-old orphaned boy under the care of his town's mayor and a bit of an outsider due to his ability to control the Forbidden Arms, which in this Wild Arms title mean advanced relic machines, and refers to any piece of lost technology, though most often it is used to allude to the weapons Rudy and a few others are able to use. Jack is a treasure hunter in search of absolute power in order to rectify some past failings. A past that is as tragic as it is mysterious. He's accompanied by his friend Handpan, a wind mouse that helps him solve puzzles and keeps him company. Jack utilizes the ancient technique known as Fast Draw, which delivers powerful blows to opponents. Despite being incredibly snarky and initially dismissive of his companions, he eventually grows quite fond of them. Cecilia is the daughter of King Adelheid, and as the game starts, has spent most of her life in Curon Abbey, training in magic and studying her family heirloom, the Teardrop. She can bind elements to crests in order to learn and cast different spells. Her story is a classic coming-of-age tale that documents her many realizations of what it's like to be in the real world, while simultaneously deeply desiring that those closest to her don't only accept and tolerate her because of her status. After a brief introduction of every character and a setting up of the first half of the game, we see the team depart to enlist the help of the mystical Guardians, which are deity-like creatures that take many different physical forms and are almost all forces of good, though this can get a bit more complicated. The team is attempting to thwart the plan of a band of demons called the Quarter Knights. The demons have been protecting and keeping watch over their defeated leader's body, called Mother. Some 1,000 years prior to the game, the demons and their leader were defeated, with parts of Mother's heart stored all over the world to keep her incessantly regenerating body from ever fully recovering. Wild Arms does several clever and trope-breaking things in the narrative, while still certainly not venturing too far from expectations. Heck, even Rudy's beginnings feels hilariously similar to Randy's from Secret of Mana, with a few meaningful alterations. These are often minor, but still quite effective. For instance, early on the party goes through a trial so that the Guardians can determine their worth. They all fail their personal tests and are harshly judged by the Guardians, despite them reluctantly choosing to aid the party anyway, knowing full well that they might be the planet's only shot. This was refreshing. They didn't sing the party's praises or spew cliche after cliche about destiny or fate. Instead, they informed them of their task and doubted their abilities, going so far as to call them weak-minded. There are other examples, but I don't want to spoil some of the more big-picture revelations. The writers did an excellent job of establishing a history and a world. and a past that is alive in the present state of the game world and often explored through NPC's dialogue and wonderful cutscenes. While the writing in spots could have been better and the translation had various rough patches with far too many grammatical errors and odd phrasings, I must reiterate that I loved the world, and despite it not being as heavy on Western motifs and styles as I would have liked, it still felt distinctly different than many of its contemporaries and excelled at creating a deep struggle and an imminent threat. The aforementioned long stretches that offered little story were certainly problematic, and again, these pacing issues did cause some occasional disconnection, but nothing that wasn't instantly rescued when the story picked back up. Though Wild Arms uses colorful 2D graphics with fabulous late 16-bit styled sprites during normal gameplay, they elected to use 3D during combat. The nascent 3D technology certainly looks just like you'd expect from an early PS1 title, but I won't dwell on that, as telling people that it hasn't aged well is akin to stating that the sky is blue, and I've said this in other reviews. Wild Arms uses a turn-based system where inputs determine actions to be taken and turn order is determined by the response stat. Each turn the player elects, with each character, whether to guard, attack, use items, or character-specific abilities. Wild Arms also provides the player a chance to change equipment every turn, which is a rare and immediately useful option. Each character has a unique ability. Rudy has arms, utilizing devastating attacks but with limited ammo. Arms can be upgraded in 3 different ways: the hit rate, the power, and the ammo capacity. Jack's fast draw ability has a multitude of ways to inflict damage and status elements, and several of the techniques have some interesting interactions, like the phaser zap, which depends on an equipped ring's element. Cecilia uses magic that can be learned by spending crest graphs, which is an item you find while exploring, at magic shops. There are also runes that can be equipped that give statistical boosts and allow the player to summon powerful guardians in combat. Most guardians have specific elements associated with them, so carefully choosing which ones to summon is important. Unfortunately, I didn't end up relying on summons. They didn't feel particularly powerful until later in the game. There is also the Force bar, which is a bar divided into 4 separate, equally sized pieces. Force increases as turns pass, as you attack, and as you get attacked. If a character gets full force, you will get Condition Green, which eliminates any bad status effects a character currently has, but doesn't restore HP or MP. It's a nice way of giving a player an out if he or she doesn't have the required item to remove a particularly devastating ailment. There are a lot of working parts in Wild Arms combat, but it never felt overwhelming or overly complex. It flows wonderfully and is tightly paced in every battle. You can immediately make use of character-specific abilities and, as the fight progresses, make use of character-specific force abilities, all the while preparing for a summon if necessary. Again, the execution here is near perfect. Each character has a role, with a little flexibility depending on how you use a few items that offer permanent stat boosts, and most engagements are balanced around maximizing each character's capabilities within that role. And considering the game's various stylistic choices, you're bound to see all kinds of different attacks, from guns to swords to summon guardians. There's enough variation here to keep the game from getting visually stagnant. While I do wish there had been more enemies to challenge me to use different strategies, because I was literally able to rely on plain attacks and Rudy's leveled up hand cannon for the majority of the game's normal encounters. Heck, even most of the bosses boil down to all-out attack with Rudy and Jack and heal with Cecilia, but this frustration was a common problem with some early turn-based games as well. Some of the late-game encounters and bosses more than made up for the early encounters' lack of diverse exchanges. Wild Arms combat was smooth, unencumbered by some of the resolution issues accompanied by other titles of its time, and other than some visually unimpressive guardians, many of the spells and abilities looked great and sufficiently over the top, without being absurd. When coupled with some wonderful sound design, the entire system worked really well and ended up being my favorite part of the game. The dungeon crawling portions were kept exciting by the puzzle solving aspect of the game, and really that's perhaps too strong of a term for it. Each character has tools that can all be put to use in different ways. For instance, early on Rudy has access to bombs that blow holes through walls to reach previously inaccessible areas, and Jack can use a grapple hook to cross ledges or shoot handpan, his mouse remember, over to hit switches for the party, and they all unlock more as the game progresses. The commonality of criticisms lobbed at this part of the game leads me to believe that people, or critics, really didn't enjoy the dungeon crawling and puzzle solving aspect of the game, or felt it simply wasn't challenging or competent enough. While the puzzles weren't really brain teasers, and even when they weren't really brain teasers for the right reasons, I found it to be a great diversion and again a rarely, in that era at least, utilized way of engaging players. Often JRPGs view dungeon crawling segments as purely a war of attrition. The player, it seems, is only there to grind and wade through the onslaught of random encounters while simultaneously praying they purchased enough items. This added a different element, a fun element, one that kept me on my toes and made the all too often dungeon drudgery feel a bit less painful. When I talked about execution earlier in the review, this is precisely what I was referencing. Almost all of the gameplay elements are so wonderfully constructed and put into use. Rarely will the player feel that an aspect of its gameplay is entirely over or underdeveloped. I loved the combat and the dungeons. It could have probably benefited from a corny western-themed version of sorts, but these parts were excellent nonetheless. It is unfortunate that Wild Arms was almost immediately upstaged by Final Fantasy VII. It's a very worthy and polished title that is too often downplayed by those that forget how early it actually came in the PS1's grand catalog of RPGs, myself included. Though the story hits some serious snags along the way, mostly with pacing, and it doesn't necessarily distinguish itself outside of the Western theme and puzzle-solving dungeon elements typically not associated with older JRPGs, it's every bit as brilliant as many of its contemporaries and deserves more credit than it gets. Its soundtrack is rarely mentioned when discussing the game, and that is just genuinely upsetting. Michiko Naruke worked hard and was heavily influenced by spaghetti westerns. There's even a song that has the same melody of the iconic The Ecstasy of Gold from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The soundtrack features instrumentation from mandolins, finger cymbals, trumpets, and whistling to help reproduce that Old West feel. This game impressed me. I'll definitely be returning to this series in the near future. Also, I elected to play the original for a few crucial reasons. Despite some noted and distinct improvements in important areas like story, translation, and gameplay cohesion, I didn't like the alteration of the soundtrack and the 2D world and the lack of equipment upgrades. I know Alter Code-esque graphical improvements alone might have been worth it to some, but it actually felt quite different from the original. And that's not a bad thing, it is an excellent game, but I wanted to view Wild Arms in its originally released state, busted translation and all. I'd actually recommend playing both, but play the original first. You won't regret it. If you enjoyed the review, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. My Twitter is also located right below the video. This has been Andrew with High Level Reviews, and I appreciate you guys stopping by.